So, we're about to go into the weekend of games, probably a little bit late on this. So, as you can see, I'm probably going to get this uploaded at 1 p.m. on a Saturday. Generally, I wanted these videos to go out on a Friday, but my schedule's been a little bit busy. Anyways, enough fanning around. New videos on ideally Fridays or Saturdays, where we discuss the midweek Europe matches, which hasn't started yet. And then we'll talk about Friday night football, which in this case, as we can see, is the West Ham versus Chelsea result on the top left. I think the bets are in that I think Potter's going to be the first manager fired. Quite honestly, these are two back-to-back horrible results. A 3-0 loss to a potential relegation rival at this point, and then a 5-1 loss at home to Chelsea, a London rival, with fans leaving already. Second game of the season. I think we're cruising for a bruising for Potter. West Ham needs just everything. They're very, very heavily reliant on perhaps just two key signings, two key players in Paqueta and Bowden. And clearly both their defense and their midfield are just not strong enough to provide. Sorry, there's a little bit of noise in the background. So, moving on, let's talk about the key matches I've identified this week to have a discussion about. So the first key match will be happening on Saturday, which is Burnley versus Sunderland, a relegation battle. And based on what we saw, Burnley coming off a 3-0 loss, Sunderland coming off a 3-0 win, one home, one away, respectively. I think, based on what I saw in the first game, it would be easy to feel like Sunderland are probably going to be doing better. However, we've not seen Burnley at home, and generally, relegation teams need to make their home essentially a fortress. Given that, and given the defensive solidity of Burnley in the Championship, I would say that I feel like this would be a low-scoring game. I feel perhaps it'll be a 1-1 draw between Burnley and Sunderland to reflect that. I expect Sunderland to go ahead, Burnley to be defensively solid, perhaps get a goal. The next match I've identified as a key match is going to be quite spicy given all of the transfer dealings. And I might just turn this into the Isak video. So originally I wanted to do my sort of thought piece on the Isak transfer saga. And so I'll just do it here. This is probably a great spot. So at St. James's Park, we have Newcastle at home against Liverpool. Now, my thoughts on the Isak situation is that I think Newcastle are essentially, I think both parties are wrong. I believe that Isak is wrong in how he's going about things. I believe he's wrong in refusing to play. And I think this is a horrible way of trying to get your way out of the club. That being said, Newcastle haven't done themselves any favours. Let's not pretend like Newcastle have been beacons of how to run your club. I would liken this to, for example, if you were working at your company and let's say last year you let your boss know, hey, I'm looking to potentially, keep this role for about a year and then I'll be moving on. You wouldn't do anything contract-wise because it's about a year away, but you've let them know that you have an intention to leave. Now, this is obviously believing what Isak's potentially saying. Then a year later, you revisit it and you perform brilliantly. You bring record profits in for the company. And then you say, hey, like we said a year ago, I'm looking to leave. And then to try and keep you there, your boss tries and gives you a new contract and says, hey, I know you want to leave, but here's a contract to consider. And what you say, okay, I'll take my time to consider it. And, your boss says, hey, look, we're looking to get some new hires in to make the club, progress. We've just won our first cup. We're in the Champions League. Or in this case, we've just made record profits and we're looking to expand our business. And then you're like, okay, give me a couple minutes or give me a couple of days, couple of weeks whilst I consider your new contract offer. But then suddenly there's a new CEO who's done some company restructuring and fires the boss who's offered you this new contract and said, hey, you're signed to us anyway. So you know what? You're just going to see out your contract. I don't care what we were previously promised. I don't care about, the negotiations that go on. You're going to, and also, all those new hires, we're not bringing them on. We're going to try and cut down on the company because we want to get record profits for us as a club. And quite honestly, we don't care about your feelings. That's basically the situation. And so in my opinion, you're being, and then equally, you are being scouted by a different company. And this other company has said, hey, we're willing to buy out this contract at a very reasonable price. It's not what you're expecting. It's slightly lower, but, it's still potentially record numbers of profit for you. You will have doubled your money, and you would be able to go. And then your new CEO has decided, let me think about it. And then this new project's getting started, and your CEO is basically dilly-dallied. He's gone off on holiday for some reason. He's trying to get some cheap hires. He keeps failing. Rival companies keeps taking all these potential new hires he's getting. And at the end of the day, he's like, oh, well, we haven't got anything new, so you're just going to see out your contract. That's the scenario we've got. It's a quite tortured analogy, but obviously that's the transfer saga ultimately. Now, I think Newcastle is a mess of a club, and this is coming from a Spurs fan. Obviously, we're fresh off the Eze thing. I might make a dedicated video once that saga's over. But as a club, you have failed to sign and strengthen your squad in any meaningful way. You have a player who is potentially one of the best strikers in the world, and you've promised him a better contract, and it's all relative. Obviously, to me, 150k a week is ridiculous amounts of money, and being offered more than that now that I've made moves to leave, is ridiculous. However, people have been sort of clowning on Arsenal for offering Trossard a new contract. Well, things like that are supposed to tie the player down. If you want to keep your best players, you offer them better contracts early on. You don't make them unhappy and then be like, hey, it's like if you messed around, upset your partner for whatever reason, and then went about, trying to buy them things or try to make nice. You should be doing that throughout. Like, you had a player, you had a chance to increase his salary, you knew his value, you knew he was one of the best strikers. You've had the January period, you had from last year to this year, you had multiple seasons to increase his wages and increase his income. Now, Newcastle will obviously talk about PSR, and I believe that is a significant factor. Unfortunately, it's just Newcastle is not a great market for football. You have one of the most dedicated fan bases, a very storied history, but honestly, the commentators that I've seen talk about it, I agree mostly with probably what Rory Jennings has said. But the other commentators that I've listened to, like True Geordie and Alan Shearer, are both out of their mind, obviously with bias. Because, quite honestly, why would I, as somebody who's not necessarily in love with the city of Newcastle, although grateful for the opportunity, why should I give up my greatest sort of years of my life wasting away when you clearly are not matching my ambitions? Like, what's tying me to stay here? And what happened to freedom of choice? It's like, oh, you've got a contract. Okay, so contracts essentially, like, so the company, so going back to the analogy, basically a company is allowed to fire you. So if Isak, let's say, didn't perform, right? Do you think Newcastle would have kept him and not signed a new striker and tried to sell him on? What happens to his contract then? What happens to his rights as a player then? Like, I don't see this point being raised by like True Geordie or like Alan Shearer. What if he wasn't the greatest striker? What if he had a career-ending injury? Would they not try to move him on to whichever club, and then it's not really his choice anymore? And it's like, oh yeah, but he would still be being paid out for his contract. Yeah, and they'd be trying to get rid of him. they'd be trying to get rid of him really quick, wouldn't they? So why shouldn't he be like, hey, my ambitions aren't being matched by a club. You haven't made me happy, and you've made promises to me that I don't feel like you fulfilled. I want to leave. I think he's well within his rights to establish that. Now, there are ways of going about it, and like I said right at the beginning of this, I disagree with how he's going about it. But ultimately, I believe it should be an equal relationship. And also, quite honestly, as a club, if you don't want to play for my club, and this extends to, for example, Eberiche Eze, if you don't want to play for my club, don't play for my club. Like, some players you love, some players are there for a paycheck, right? Kudus, despite perhaps some people thinking it's cringy and obviously like people don't believe, he said, oh, it's always Spurs. The fact that he did that endears him to me as a player. The fact that he said things like that. Gyökeres to Arsenal, the fact that he said it's always been Arsenal, despite it not being a great first game, it makes you want the player, right? Isak doesn't want to play for you, Newcastle. Let him go. And he's at the peak of his value now. What are you going to do? You don't have strikers. You've messed around in the transfer market. At this point, everyone knows you've messed out. He's going to have, let's say you keep him and you have a poor season and we go through this again next season. Do you think his value is going to go up with everybody in the whole world knowing that he wants to leave your club? Like, do you think his value is going to go up from 120 or 130 million, which is what you've been offered, which is a ridiculous amount of money, by the way? Like, do you not feel like you could strengthen with a, up and coming striker? Why don't you work on your scouting network? Why don't you try and bring in more players? Why don't you, buy 3 or 4 players with that money? Like 3 or 4 40 million pound players, take a punt on a striker partner. In the meantime, keep your wingers have been pretty good. You've got lots of options with that. Next year, I think his contract's going to come down by a year. So it's going to go from 3 years down to 2. He's going to be worth less. So I would say perhaps I guess 70 to 80 million perhaps if he's had a really poor season. Like, I don't understand why you would want to keep a player who doesn't want to play for you. He just doesn't want to be there. If I have an employee who doesn't want to work for me, I'm going to try and let him go. Anyways, the next game I wanted to talk about, that's been a longer run than I expected actually, is the Spurs game, which I'll probably do every single week. We're playing City away. It's a difficult game. We've had a tough week. We don't have a cam. We had Pape Sarr sort of like going into that role. All of our cams are injured. Maddison injury prone. Kulusevski run into the ground last season and also has an injury, I believe. So we're going to have a tough match, I think. I think City, although we're kind of a bogey team for them, I think we're more of a bogey team when we're at home. So at City's home at the Etihad, I would feel like a 3-1 loss perhaps, if I'm very honest. Although I'm hoping for a draw. And let's talk about the rest of the Big Six games very quickly. Arsenal, they need to show something. And you know what? This is the exact kind of side that you bought Gyökeres for. You probably want Havertz and probably Eze at this point to play in games like the United game, like those big games where you have a more reliable system and you grind out wins, because you haven't lost in the past, I think, 4 or 5 seasons to any of the Big Six. But in games like this, which, you had a ridiculous number of draws for, you need a Gyökeres to sort of pull you through. And he looked a bit shaky in his first game, but I expect him to score. I think this is going to be an easy 3-0 Arsenal. Maybe 4-0. 4-0 Arsenal. There we go. Despite, a little bit of bitterness that they've taken Eze. And Fulham away from United have Fulham away. Now, I feel like this is a bogey match for United. Throughout their history, I always note that this is a match that they, I believe, lost 2-1 quite regularly to Fulham at Craven Cottage. So I think they need to build on their performance. Yes, you had a good performance against Arsenal. I would say, though, to be fair, I think Amarin had quite good performances against the big teams last year. It was his performance against the mid to lower table teams that left United hovering around the relegation zone. So Amarin has a lot to prove here. I'm going to choose to believe in him. I think he's going to grind out a 2-0 win against Fulham, if I'm honest. Okay, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you think about the Isak situation. And what your thoughts are on the Eze situation. Clown me if you want. I don't really care. And catch you guys next time. Probably on Tuesday. Peace.